Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us today for this important session on strengthening investigations and prosecutions for crimes and attacks against journalists. Our moderator for today's session is Nanny Jansen Reventlow, and she is the director of the Digital Freedom Fund. We are joined by an expert panel of speakers, and it's my pleasure to present to you our first speaker, Ian Lafreniere, former spokesperson of the Montreal Police and currently the minister responsible for Indigenous Affairs of Quebec. Our second speaker, Jeannette Manning, is a prosecutor and representative of the International Association of Prosecutors. And our final speaker is Dr. Romolemo Mushweu, who is Chief Executive Officer of the South African Judicial Education Institute and rapporteur of the Forum of Legal Actors. Before I give the floor to our moderator, Nanny, I would like to remind our viewers that the Ask the Guest function is open for any questions you'd like to ask. You can also react on the chat function on the platform. At the end of the session, we will go through some of your questions. And Dr. Romolemo Mushweu will join us in a few minutes. And now, without further ado, I invite Nanny to please begin the session.
Thank you, Karim. Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our speakers and members of the audience. This session marks the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, which is commemorated annually on the 2nd of November. According to UNESCO data, in the past 14 years, close to 1,200 journalists have been killed for reporting the news and for bringing information to the public. On average, this constitutes one death every 4 days. In 9 out of 10 cases, the killers go unpunished. Impunity leads to more killings and is often a symptom of worsening conflict and the breakdown of law and judicial systems. A free, pluralistic media landscape requires that the media are able to carry out their work in a safe environment. This is why impunity for attacks against journalists has huge consequences on the possibility for journalists to work freely and for the public to receive reliable information. As we will see, this is particularly relevant when it comes to issues of corruption, environmental crimes, and political wrongdoings. The issue of crimes and attacks against journalists is a complex one, which requires the involvement of multiple actors and stakeholders. This is why today we have gathered a panel of experts with various profiles to discuss this important issue of impunity. Thank you again for being present with us today. I will now give the floor back to Karim to begin our session with a short video.
Thank you, Nanny. We are now going to show a short video clip developed for UNESCO's campaign, Protect Journalists, Protect the Truth, to shed a light on the dangers faced by journalists around the world.
Back then, we realized corruption was centralized. Now it's a free-for-all, serious corruption.
ต้องมีกระบวนการต้องใช้ว่าเป็นกระบวนการค้ามนุษย์กระบวนการค้าคน
calling for urgent action to address the human rights crisis.
لا يوجد ناخبين اصلا لا يوجد ناخبين ومانعين الناخبين من الدخول.
And now they want to continue upending environmental laws.
Comment être serein quand on sait qu'il y a des policiers qui se manquent et qui ne sont pas sanctionnés?
The press is under a lot of attacks from all sorts of quarters.
She's a journalist!
It has nothing to do with immorality. I'm just a journalist wearing jeans and t-shirt.
Maintenant, nous faisons face à des intimidations physiques.
Mi esposo lo agarraron con otros 4 muchachos viniendo a una reunión del M19 aquí en Matagalpa.
Je me dis que le gouvernement n'est pas là pour emprisonner les journalistes.
Journalists have to report fairly and independently, but it's extremely difficult when so many of them are being killed.
Mais on sait que demain, après-demain, ça peut être toi.
A very serious and very important topic. Nanny, back to you. Nanny, we can't hear you at the moment. Something wrong with your sound system, I think. Could you speak?
Can I try again?
Yeah, thank you very much. You're back again. Thank you.
My apologies for that. So as we can see from the video and slideshow, impunity for crimes and attacks against journalists still remains incredibly high. According to Unesco's report, in the period of 2018 to 2019, UNESCO recorded a total of 156 killings of journalists worldwide. The year 2019 shows the lowest death toll in the last decade, but still with 57 deaths. Impunity for crimes against journalists continues to prevail, with only 13% of cases of killings of journalists reported as resolved as of 2020, compared to 11% in 2018. In 2019, the highest number of fatal attacks occurred in the Latin America and the Caribbean region, representing 40% of the total killings registered worldwide, followed by the Asia and Pacific region with 26% of killings. Most journalists were killed in countries with no armed conflict. In the period of 2018 to 2019, 57% of killings occurred in countries with no armed conflict, compared to 43% in countries with armed conflict. Bearing this in mind, how can we tackle this dangerous issue? According to you, our esteemed panelists, what are the bottlenecks to a prompt resolution of attacks against journalists in the world? I'm first going to ask Ian Lafreniere, as a former police officer, to please give us your thoughts on these questions.
Well, thank you, and good morning to all of you. This is an important, very important question, and watching those images, it's shocking. It's sad and shocking, seeing journalists getting attacked. And every time I see an attack on a journalist, I consider that as an attack on citizens, on the community, because journalists are there to represent the interests of the community. So this is extremely important and shocking. We need to establish and to respect the role of journalists in our society. I've been doing a lot of training, and the first thing I was trying to establish is the role of journalists, and to pointing out that journalists are a pillar of our democracy. I don't want to live in a world without any journalists. And believe me, sometimes I don't like what they report on me. I don't like what they say, but you know what? This is freedom of expression, and I think as leaders we do have an important role in that. Explaining that this is exactly how it is when you talk about freedom of expression. Sometimes you don't agree with what people have said, but this is freedom of expression. And journalists have such an important role. We need to do more training on security forces. This is important. And also, generally speaking, especially now with the pandemic, it's getting tough for media. It's getting tough for journalists. Why that is? Because we get a lot of people that believe in conspiracy. And since then, they believe that there's a lot of fake news, and journalists are not reporting exactly what they believe in. So because of that, there's a lot of attack on the social medias. It's not physical, but believe me, this is the same intention. They're attacking journalists, they're attacking their credibility, they're attacking what they've said. And I think we need to address that. Yes, freedom of expression is important, but we need to strengthen our rules, our laws, to give a consequence to people that are committing those attacks, those very aggressive attack on social medias as well. And this is even worse now because of the pandemic. We do live that as elected officials. We receive so many threats now because people are, I guess, quite impatient and angry. But this is an important thing also.
Thank you very much, Ian. Now, as representatives of the public interest, prosecutors form an active role in criminal proceedings. Jeanette Manning, in your role as attorney and a representative of the International Association of Prosecutors, could you please share with us your assessment in working on this project related to impunity when it comes to crimes against journalists, and what prosecutors and investigators must do to address these challenges?
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. First, I want to thank UNESCO for taking the time to address this very important issue. One, to raise awareness, to actually focus on how important this issue is. I also want to acknowledge, first and foremost, that although I worked on this project and I was excited to work on this project on behalf of IAP, I first want to also acknowledge publicly the individual who was the primary author in actually drafting the guideline, which I know we will talk about in more detail later. So I'd like to actually give public acknowledgement and credit to Sabine Ouellette, who was a former Canadian prosecutor, lifelong prosecutor, who devoted his life to ensuring justice is met. And he actually was a primary author of this guideline. And so with respect to my assessment on this guideline, one thing that I can say is that it is very important that these guidelines have actually been prepared and established. And I actually commend the relationship between IAP and Unesco, because what a better group of individuals to come together to work on this project. You have an International Association of Prosecutors who have prosecutors, thousands upon thousands of prosecutors who are actually members of the organization. And then in addition to that, you have UNESCO, where there's a huge focus on protecting journalists, which is a very important topic. So in terms of my assessment of this project, what became evidently clear is that there clearly are not enough systems in place for purposes of awareness. And so having a forum like this to raise awareness is extremely important, but awareness in the context of how prosecutors think. Oftentimes, prosecutors are working under very difficult time constraints and conditions. Oftentimes, they are overworked and underpaid, have huge caseloads, and therefore they might look at these cases involving journalists and approach them very traditionally the way they look at any other case. And so the assessment is that there absolutely is a need for training. So I echo what my colleague Ian said, but most importantly, from the perspective of specialized training for prosecutors in the context of working on these specific cases. The other thing that is very important that we learned from an assessment is the importance of how prosecutors approach these cases. And so in that context, I mean specifically learning to think outside of the box, that prosecutors oftentimes might look at a case, look at the fact that a crime has been committed. But when you're talking specifically about crimes that affect journalists, they're crimes that extend well beyond the traditional realms of typical criminal justice issues. You're looking at crimes that are specifically targeted to a particular population, here being journalists. And as a result of that, that has a long-term effect on democracy. It has a long-term effect on, just as my colleague Ian said, society as a whole, but it also has an effect on freedom of expression and human rights. And so in this project, what we learned is that certainly there's a lot of room for improvement throughout the world. This is not just, even though Nani, you specifically referenced specific regions from the report that the UN just put out. However, we've noticed that this is an issue that impacts everyone globally, prosecutors in every part of the world, and prosecutors in every part of the world absolutely need to be educated to raise awareness and know how to appropriately handle these very complex cases.
Thank you so much, Annette, for that input. I actually also wanted to ask a question to Homolemo Moshweu. Just wanted to check, and I see that she has just joined us. Welcome.
Yes.
I would like to invite you. Good morning or afternoon, I think it is even already by now.
It's afternoon.
I would like to. Good afternoon. I would like to invite your views on the issue of what we can actually do to tackle the issue of impunity for attacks against journalists.
I need to preface my comments by saying that, as you know, South Africa, we have gone through long-term internal conflict in the face of apartheid. And we are now on that, what I'll call reconciliation agenda, which has got its own painful experiences and obviously resulting from racial inequalities and disparities. And that has got, people are still not trusting each other generally. Even those that are in power, when for example, a journalist is covering and a member of the executive where wrong things are happening, then they exercise their power. They exercise their power to suppress what journalists are supposed to do. And I think, you know, it was all over the world. The recent example, the recent event in South Africa at Parliament, where they use a jamming device to make sure that journalists are not able to do their work. And also during COVID, we had few instances where journalists were harassed for doing their work. We had one even, I would say, using the old term of skipping the country for safety because of abuse of power. So I've just linked that with what I'm doing, that as the head of the institute, we are really working very hard to try and to raise awareness around the audience that we are mandated to train, to be aware of these issues, that these issues are abuse and they need to be addressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Homolemo. Before moving on to our next segment, we are pleased to share with you a short video by Nadim Houri, Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative. Nadim is also a member of the IBARI Secretariat High-Level Panel of Legal Experts on Media Freedom and will be presenting their newly published report.
Hello, everyone. The report by the High-Level Panel of Legal Experts set out to answer two key questions. One, why are so few investigations into attacks on journalists succeeding and leading to prosecution? And two, what can be done to tackle the issue? Our starting point was the fact that the situation is not getting better despite multiple and important initiatives over the last decade. We identified two types of reasons for the ongoing impunity. One is lack of capacity, with local authorities often not having the know-how or the resources to adequately protect the crime scene, exploit forensic evidence, or question powerful suspects. But more often than not, it is the lack of political will, with authorities unwilling to really investigate. Why? Because journalists tend to bother those in power. So how do you break this vicious circle? One approach is to say we need to train local law enforcement. This is important and has been taking place in a number of countries, but we know that this takes years, if not decades. And frankly, in countries where we have seen such efforts, the results have been underwhelming. So what can be done internationally in quick order? The main recommendation of this report is to set up a standing investigative task force made of vetted and trained international investigators, forensic experts, legal specialists that can quickly deploy to the crime scene and support investigations. Now, they could support national investigations, investigations by regional or UN mechanisms, and in some cases, even NGO-led investigations. Where should this investigative task force exist? Ideally, it would exist within a UN mandate, and the report joins the growing number of voices calling for a permanent investigative body within the UN system. But we also recognize in the report that, regrettably, the creation of a permanent UN investigative body does not seem to currently have sufficient political support. So until such time that there is such support, we need to work on an alternative to improve the situation. And this is why the report recommends that the almost 40 countries that have formed the Media Freedom Coalition and pledged to work to protect media, that they set up a multilateral investigative task force that could support these investigations. Now, the countries would need to commit sufficient financial resources to support the task force. They would need to make available qualified nationals, but also they would need to commit to use their political advocacy in bilateral and multilateral contexts to facilitate the work of the investigative task force, and most importantly, the access of its investigators to potential crime scenes. In conclusion, to tackle rampant impunity, we must adopt new strategies. This includes thinking of ways of getting investigators to the crime scene as soon as possible. And to achieve that objective, the report sees no other way but pushing for new forms of collaboration between the UN, individual member states, and NGOs. It cannot be business as usual. Thank you.
Thank you all for this first round of stimulating discussions. Now, before we move along to our next segment, I would like to remind our viewers that they can actively participate in this session through the Ask the Guests function or the chat function on the platform. Many of us have heard about the cases of the murders of the Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia in 2016 and the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2019. But what about the countless other attacks and murders on local journalists, often covering local stories such as corruption, crimes, and trafficking? Most of the time, these cases are in the news for a couple of hours, sometimes not even that much, and then the story quickly fades away without much consequences for the perpetrators of these crimes. In this segment, we shall be talking a little bit more about how prosecutors and law enforcement can better investigate and prosecute crimes and attacks against journalists. I would now like to invite Jeanette Manning, as the representative of the International Association of Prosecutors, to please present the new guidelines on investigating and prosecuting crimes and attacks against journalists, which was developed by UNESCO and the IAP.
Thank you so much. The first thing I want to note specifically about these guidelines first is that they will become available this afternoon on UNESCO and IAP's website. And so for anyone who's listening, please know that this guideline itself will actually be available for you to review in detail. And the other thing I want to note specifically about the guidelines as well is that what they were intended to do and what they were not intended to do. These guidelines were set up to establish best practices, best considerations, and things for prosecution service offices throughout the world, to figure out how they would like to address these issues. It was not intended to be a step-by-step guide on how to investigate and prosecute these cases, and that was intentional. The goal here is for prosecutors to ensure that they maintain their independence as well as their discretion. Also understanding that we're working under different legal systems. In some countries you have common law systems, and in other countries you have civil law systems. And each system oftentimes will actually provide constraints in terms of how to handle these cases. And therefore this guideline that was prepared was simply serve as a foundational document so that prosecutors, one, it provides for raising awareness so that they're aware of these issues and how they specifically target and affect journalists specifically. And secondly, the guideline itself also provides an opportunity for prosecutors to be able to operate in a space that is intended to be free from harm and retaliation. Understanding that these are going to be concerns in many parts of the world, this guideline serves as a foundational document to give them an opportunity to learn how to look at these cases, because oftentimes they're very complex. More specifically, the guidelines themselves, they are not intended to be orders as to how prosecutors are to handle these cases, but it's to provide assistance to them to handle them better. And there are specific areas, about 5 different areas very quickly, I would like to highlight about the guideline itself. One, it's important that in this guideline, it is noted, and the focus is specifically on impunity, how to address impunity, how to ensure that prosecutors handle these cases in a manner that looks at specifically the contextual analysis, as you'll see on the slide. And by that, what we mean specifically is that we want prosecutors to look beyond the crime immediately before them. Think about the motive behind the crime itself. And so if it's a situation involving gender, to what extent did the fact that it was a female journalist who was engaged in particular activity, to not ignore that fact, to pay attention to what the evidence shows you, but also look at the broader context. If a journalist was, for instance, investigating corruption or high-level government officials, to ensure that that is also part of, as an investigator, part of your investigation, and as a prosecutor, part of your job to look at the overall evidence. And the one thing that is so critically important that I need to note here is we want to ensure that prosecutors and investigators, regardless of the system that you operate in, that you work together and that you build trust and you build these relationships so that at the time that these cases go before courts or prosecutors are making assessments as to whether they're going to proceed with a prosecution or not, that the prosecutor is armed with essential information to help meet his or her burden of proof. And so it's critically important to look at motives behind why journalists specifically have been targeted in the particular journalists that the prosecutor happens to be considering whether to proceed with a case or not. Secondly, we wanted to focus on the fact that when you are conducting, as a prosecutor or supervising a case, you need to contemplate what evidence is before you and what available charges are there. And so, for instance, if there is a threat that is made against a journalist and a prosecutor opts to pursue that threat, that the prosecutor shouldn't necessarily stop there. If there's sufficient evidence that provides for and allows for the prosecutor to look at enhanced and escalating offenses, that the prosecutor should always use that as an opportunity if there's sufficient evidence there to prove that. And that goes back to all of these are interconnected and related. It goes back to the fact that prosecutors have to learn to think outside of the box and not just look at the immediate facts that are before them, but they have to look at the overall context and all of the facts that are readily available to them in determining what offenses should be. Thirdly, it's important that, and this has already been noted, but it is important for prosecutors to always bear in mind the escalating offenses, but also looking at the sufficiency of the evidence. And third, moving on to the third one, as your slide here notes, the confidentiality of journalist sources. This cannot be stressed enough. How important it is that prosecutors in these particular cases absolutely must ensure that they protect journalist sources. That is mandatory. These cases oftentimes, as you noted, Nani, sometimes they actually rise to the level of serious and supreme national attention. Other times they do not. But regardless, in order for journalists to be able to perform their jobs appropriately, conduct appropriate investigations, and ensure that freedom of expression is met, it is critically important that prosecutors work very well with superiors to monitor these cases, but also ensure that in that context that they're protecting confidential sources. And lastly, if the slide can be shown, the last item that's critically important is for the transnational dimension of these crimes. It requires an information sharing among states and nations. And what that means is there are various protocols and procedures and treaties and conventions as well as resolutions put into place to allow for this. But most commonly, what is utilized in an international forum to allow for the sharing of information is something called the Mutual Legal Treaty Assistance. And that specifically relates to obtaining evidence that is obtained, and it goes by the name of MLAT for short. But that process in of itself is what prosecutors utilize globally in order to obtain and receive evidence that may be held in another nation or in another state. And that is critically important. And there are very formal procedures by which prosecutors can demand this information and to receive this information and evidence. However, more than anything, having relationships, building trust among nations, and developing those relationships helps to facilitate that cooperative process and a cooperative arrangement to allow for the MLAT process to work a little bit more smoothly. So those are some of the main highlights of the guidelines. But again, they go in great detail to look at various aspects and the importance of prosecuting these cases, coupled with assisting prosecutors to identify the primary issues that they're likely to see when handling these very complex cases.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, for providing such a comprehensive overview. I have a follow-up question. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how it's going to be ensured that these guidelines are disseminated and used by prosecutors in various countries.
No, that's a great question, and thank you so much for that question. Well, thankfully, with the relationship between UNESCO and IAP, I am happy to report on behalf of IAP, but in conjunction with UNESCO, they've already contemplated this. The efforts here were not meant to just be simplified in producing a document. That was not the goal. The goal is to produce a document that is effective and actually going to help prosecutors, and in addition to that, put it into practice. As everyone has stated, training is needed, capacity building is needed, building cooperation among nations, among prosecutors is needed. And thankfully, in the space of IAP, we actually have an environment set up where prosecutors can actually interact and learn from one another in the form of regional conferences, annual conferences, papers that are made available to members, guidance and assistance. And so what is intended here going forward is for this guideline to be shared globally with prosecutors and all contacts that IAP has. IAP has relationships with other national and international organizations throughout the world, many of whom focus specifically and precisely on prosecuting, although IAP has the largest number of global prosecutors throughout the world. So it's intended to be shared with all of IAP's members, and also that would then filter out into it being shared within prosecution services throughout the world. So the guideline itself will be shared, but then in addition to that, the second component is to ensure that there's training, actual capacity building. And UNESCO and IAP have already agreed to work together going forward into next year to actually provide capacity building training for prosecutors, which we'll get to the second component. So the first piece was to draft these guidelines to provide the foundational elements that the prosecutors need to raise awareness and understand the importance of how to handle these cases. The second component is already being contemplated and will be put into place next year for purposes of actually conducting actual live, hopefully post-COVID in person, but if not, at least virtually, actually conducting comprehensive training so that prosecutors are equipped with now understanding the how-to in terms of handling these cases to try to prevent impunity.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. I think we're all oddly dreaming about in-person meetings again at the moment. I'd like to now turn towards Ian. I'd like to now turn towards Ian. As we've seen, the prosecution is key in bringing perpetrators of crimes and attacks against journalists to justice. But according to you, how can the investigation by the police support prosecution? In other words, what is needed to make the collaboration between the prosecution services and the police more effective in investigating these attacks, both online and offline?
That's a tough question, and thank you for all the thoughts of Jeanette on that. And I want to point out on the point 4, transnational dimension. This is a pretty good example of where we need to adapt our laws. I'll give you an example on that. There's a lot of threats on Facebook now. And as police services, as security forces, the first thing we need to establish is the location where that crime took place. This is wrong. This is wrong. That's the reason why we need to change our laws, because we lose a lot of time to establish where the crime take place. And believe me, people doing those threats, they could be anywhere in the world, and they escalating. Very often they'll do threats against journalists. They're putting a lot of pressure on them through social media, and we're not up to that pace now as security forces, investigators. We need new laws. We need, it's been said that we need new capacity, more training. For sure, as a trainer myself, I believe in that. I mean, I believe we need to do more trainings because guidelines are extremely important. Sharing best practices, this is extremely important. But we need victims to trust the system. We need victims to trust security forces. If they don't do so, nothing's going to happen. So how you build that trust? It seems simple, but it is not at all. They need to trust the nation. They need to trust a neutral state, a state that respects fundamental rights. And this is not the case. This is not the status now. So by training security forces with journalists and medias, you build that relationship that when something is going to happen, they're going to rely on those security forces because they know someone. They know a police officer. They know a person by his name. They would call him to say, you know what, I've been a victim of threats. Something is going on. They're going to rely on that. That's why I'm always bringing back that point of training, because a lot of people think that because medias and journalists and security forces, police officers, they work side by side, they know each other. This is not the case. We believe we know each other, but we don't. I've been doing training for years now, and there's a lack of knowledge. We need to train them together. It's going to take time. It's going to take willingness. We need to change laws. We need to put more effort and more resources, more capacities to our police services. But beginning of it, our victims, they need to trust the system. They need to trust police officers. And that's why those guidelines are going to be extremely helpful.
Thank you so much for your input, Ian. Moving along to our next segment. As we all know, journalists face different types of harassment and attacks in many circumstances, including when they are covering demonstrations and civil unrests. These acts of violence sometimes come from demonstrators themselves, but also from police and law enforcement officers. We have a short video on that, right, Kareem?
Yes, that's true. Thank you, Nani. Indeed, in the first half of 2020, there has been a sharp increase in this on that global number of protests during which attacks against journalists were perpetrated by police officers themselves. We will now show a short video on this issue produced in relation to Unesco's report on the safety of journalists covering civil unrest.
While filming.
On the yellow vest protesters who've been throwing
Nani, back to you.
Thank you for this, Kareem. As we've just seen, attacks against journalists are sometimes perpetrated by the police themselves. We know that training judicial operators and security forces is essential to tackle this issue in the long term. Khomolemo, could you tell us, as the CEO of the South African Judicial Education Institute, can you tell us a little bit more about how you train members of the judiciary on human rights in general and freedom of expression and the safety of journalists in particular?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The institute, as I mentioned yesterday, it's in operation for the last 9 years, and we started focusing on substantive law and few soft skills. But for the last 3 years, we then launched what we call Human Rights Week for the members of the judiciary, where we just focus on training them on women rights related issues. In 2018, our program for that week included media presence during court proceedings. We were discussing practical challenges and resolutions. In our country, we have guidelines that the judicial officers use to make a decision whether to grant access for media to be present in court. And that has created a lot of tension. And as a result, then we then decided that we need to keep on raising awareness that even though those guidelines give judicial discretion to decide whether to give a member of the media access to court, other factors are quite critical in deciding that. During that session, we deal with the tensions between the right of freedom of expression, rights to fair trial, taking into consideration the parties in court, and the issue of audi partem rule is quite important. Hence, the judicial officers need to engage with the parties that are appearing before them. As far as human rights in general, we deal with refugee and determination of status. Just yesterday at 2:00, we had a seminar for judges where they were dealing with a refugee law. We deal with undocumented and statelessness for the children, HIV, TB and human rights, housing rights, etc. In 2019 and 2020, we also dealt with issues that relates to journalists. In 2019, we had a topic where we were discussing justice for women. And in that topic, then also the issue of harassment of female journalists was also discussed. The issue of stereotyping in the court environment, because that's also a human rights issue. It's also it features well prominently in our program. I also need to mention that this year we are the co-implementer of a UNESCO-funded project with Tanzania on the establishment of the Center of Reference for Training the judiciary on legal standards on freedom of expression. We will be conducting training for about 5 countries. So we at least there's work in the Southern Africa to try and give this important subject of freedom of expression serious attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your insights, Khomolemo. Now, in the context of social upheaval, another element which complicates this equation is the lack of trust between security forces and journalists. To respond to this and to try to establish more professional relations between these two groups, UNESCO has initiated a program for the training of security forces on freedom of expression and safety of journalists issues. Since 2013, the project has already been implemented in 17 countries around the world, and we have a short video about that.
On ne s'attaque pas à un policier, on ne s'attaque pas à un journaliste. Alors nous-mêmes, comme policiers, on ne peut pas s'attaquer à un journaliste. Il a le droit à son opinion, j'ai le droit à mon opinion. La police et les médias, on a des chemins différents. Mais on veut la même chose dans la vie. On veut protéger la démocratie, mais on veut que les gens aient accès à l'information, à la vérité. Dans notre démocratie, on a besoin de vous. Vous avez un rôle important pour apporter l'information à la population.
الايام الدراسيه اللي قاعدين نعملوا فيها هذه ليش تقريبا وجهه النظر هذه وهل هو هذه خلينا نسكروها.
Ce qui est important cette formation avec l'UNESCO, c'est l'ouverture envers les médias.
قلت العلاقه قبل ما كانتش واضحه، ما كانتش مسموح بها لا مع الصحافي ولا مع المواطن.
نجم يعرفوك لو تولي معروف تصور ما تحب براحتك، كيما نجم يعرفوك تولي مستهدف.
وقت المصادمات وقت تبدا ثم مسيرات راهي اصعب حاجه.
Ce qui est bien, c'est que durant cette formation organisée par l'UNESCO, les agents de police avouent bien qu'il y a des agressions sur les journalistes, des agressions de leur part, bien sûr, de la part des agents de police. Et je trouve personnellement que c'est un pas vers l'amélioration de la relation entre journalistes et agents de police.
كنا مكبلين بنظام شو النظام مشي قاعدة رواسبة في مخاخنا اللي يحس روحه مازال عنده شوية يسعى باش ينظف وكاب توانسة متسامحة
يخدموا في خدمه كبيره فهمتني ولا على مستوى الجريمه على مستوى مش عارف برشا حوايج الارهاب وما الى ذلك ولكن الشيء هذا ني با فالوريزي علاش؟ احنا ناقصين في الجهه هذه ناقصين دو لابسونس دو جورناليست. Voilà.
On espère que ces formations continuent. Après 2 ans que ce projet a débuté, on a vu beaucoup de changements. Je ne dis pas que tout est parfait. Il y a beaucoup de choses à corriger pour nous, les policiers, et aussi la gendarmerie, mais aussi pour les médias. C'est la mentalité tunisienne qu'on doit changer.
Ian, as one of the trainers in this video and as a former spokesperson for the Montreal Police, could you tell us a little bit more about your experience in conducting these trainings with UNESCO around the world? And in particular, what, in your opinion, is the impact of this kind of work?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you to UNESCO. That was an amazing experience and a heck of a challenge, to be honest. A few learning experience that I got through those training. First of all, I established that when leadership are present at the opening remarks, when they're present and they send a strong message about their intention, their willingness of this leadership from that security forces, this is extremely important. This is the beginning of a good training. Secondly, you got to go baby step. You saw in the video, people sitting together, journalists and security forces. That seems to be basic, but you can imagine that for a lot of these people, weeks before that, they were fighting each other on the streets. So having them sitting in the same room, for me, it was an highlight. This is what I was looking for. But you got to go baby step. I was building that trust. Day one, it was only security forces. I was training them, showing them images, videos from different countries, police action that were not right. I was showing them actually videos from America. And people get a tendency to accept that because this is not an attack on what they do on their work. So Then afterward, after a few hours of training and taking time together, I was showing them local examples, bad examples, and they accept that because I was building that trust. They accept that, you know what, we've done some bad things as police officers. We need more training. Then it was possible on day 3 to bring up journalists, bring up medias in the same room, and actually, my intention was always to conduct a very good scenarios at the end of it, and medias were playing the role of security forces, and police officers were playing the role of journalists. And it was a simulation at the end of this training. And believe me, journalists were extremely aggressive playing the police role, and police officers, when they were playing the role of journalists, they were not respecting anything. So it was a very good example for them to learn about the other profession, and it was a highlight. It was a highlight. But if I've been able to do that, it's because you go baby step. The importance of having a former or police officer can rely on, they can share their experiences. It was important, but having them sitting together and sharing their knowledge, and actually as simple as having coffee break together, talking to the other, talking to each other, and I was asking them to take that pledge that they will conduct those meetings afterward on a monthly basis, because it looked basic, but they need to know each other. They need to trust police services. If something is going wrong, they can call them. If they need information, they can call them as well. But those trainings were extremely important, because at the end of the day, we want to train the trainer. As soon as the trainer is out of this country, we need more trainers to conduct those experiences, those training, to change the mentality. It's going to take time. It's not going to change like now. It's not going to take a minute. It takes a lot of time and effort. And again, thank you for UNESCO. It was an amazing experience.
Thank you so much, Ian. For our last segment, I would like to give the floor to Gomolemo, who is also the rapporteur of the Forum of Legal Actors, which was organized yesterday. This closed meeting gathered members of the judiciary from around the world to discuss international and regional norms and standards governing freedom of expression and the safety of journalists. As the rapporteur of the Legal Forum, could you please tell us a little bit more about the key recommendations that came out of it?
Okay. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share the findings of yesterday's sessions. On the topic, the first topic was the role of national and regional courts in protecting freedom of expression. There's a number of presenters who alluded to critical points like political pressure and influence of the judiciary, the need to amend current draconian laws, attitude of the political leaders to journalists, disregard of decisions of superior courts by lower courts, threats to female journalists, especially online, and decriminalization of defamation. The key recommendations that came out of this is that there is a need to strengthen the international standards, especially the enforcement mechanisms, such as special task force composed of internal experts. These experts should work towards ensuring that investigations, prosecutions, and adjudication of crimes against journalists are prioritized. There is also, second one is that there's a need for a more effective actions to address threats against female journalists. As such actions invariably increase gender stereotyping. Lastly, there is a need for enhanced political attention to address impunity for attacks against journalists, and the international community as watchdogs should stand together to ensure a safe environment for journalists. On the second topic that dealt with capacity building at national and regional courts, the presenters shared various capacity building initiatives in their respective countries. Initiatives range from courses on media and justice at French Institute, certification course of prosecutors who deal with cases against journalists, judicial dialogues, discussion forums for judges and journalists. There was also a discussion on the link between impunity and corruption. A presenter proposed that UNESCO organizes a seminar for judges, prosecutors, and journalists on justice and media. and the proposal was supported. The key recommendations that came out of that session were that there should be dialogues involving members of the media and legal actors in order to improve the trust. The issues that require attention should be transparency, access to information, ethical conduct of both journalists and legal actors. The second one is that there is a need to strengthen training on media-related issues of legal actors in order to improve investigations, prosecution, and adjudication of cases against journalists. Attention should be paid to curriculum development, training of trainers, followed by impact assessment. The last recommendation was that there should be knowledge sharing, collaboration, and networking of forum members in order to prevent reinventing the wheel and contributing to the pillars of a democratic society. In conclusion, it is important to build synergies between the media and legal actors, which will indeed contribute to the essential pillar of democracy, which is freedom of expression. I thank you.
Thank you, Khomolemo. I think it's time now to go through some questions that our viewers have submitted.
Thank you, Nani. And thank you very much for this stimulating discussion for every one of you. We received a lot of questions. There's a lot of interaction, but I'm going to start with one practical question for Jeannette, and that is, how can we access the document of these guidelines for prosecuting crimes against journalists?
No, thank you so much for that question. Again, so the guideline itself is now complete. Unfortunately, it wasn't prepared for this particular session, but it is going to be available this afternoon. This guideline can be accessed directly through Unesco's website, as well as the International Association of Prosecutors website. So it will be on their main page where you can access it.
Thank you very much. The second question also for you, great news about the launching of the guidelines, but the implementation challenge is key to make this work. How do you think to address this?
That's actually a perfect question. Obviously, implementation is always hard, in part because you have to change culture. You have to change the cultural mindset. There also has to be leadership. And so without question, I don't think UNESCO or IAP has discounted the fact that implementation is going to be very difficult, to the extent that I believe that there is a desire. Prosecutors, I think, are hungry for information to learn how to better handle these cases. One thing that the IAP does is it trains prosecutors globally, and actually just recently established a global training academy to provide for situations such as this. And so IAP brings together and convenes possibly every single year in annual conferences and in regional conferences. And so there are many mechanisms and ways by which IAP and UNESCO working together jointly can actually provide for implementation. But first and foremost, the implementation of it, I think, actually starts with training. When you go into prosecution offices and you train prosecutors, that also includes, as Ian noted, this is critically important for any training that's done. You have to have support from leadership, executive leadership, also governments. There has to be international attention and focus given on how important this guideline is. And then internally within respective nations, it is important for governments to support this, to publicly announce that they support this. And then when you work directly with the specific prosecution service, ensuring that leadership, that you have buy-in and support from leadership, and you also train and do capacity building with leadership as well. And so the train the trainers component is critically important because that's how you ensure stability, and that's how you also ensure that it's sustainable. But the actual training is, I believe, where the implementation will actually happen. Because once you equip prosecutors with the knowledge and the wherewithal and the information they need in order to actually handle these cases practically, that is how the implementation actually is carried out.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next question is for Ian. As the UNESCO report showed a high level of violence against journalists reporting on protests, what is the role of police forces themselves in addressing this problem?
Well, this is an important question because during the training, we're establishing what were the needs for journalists, for media. First of all, they need visual. They need to see what's going on. They need to have information, and also to be protected. So during the training, we were doing a few simulation about protests, about a crime scene, and we were establishing what would be the media perimeter, what would be the perfect location to establish journalists, so they could be free of taking images, free of having information. But the most important is just to make sure that they will be safe. And that was to be dealt between journalists and security forces and police officers. And this is a very important topic, protecting journalists during protests, doing training together. This is so important because they know what are the tactics of police forces, what they do, why they do such actions when there is a riot or when it's going wrong. So they can put themselves in a safe spot and they could be protected by police officers. So again, I'm going back to training.
Thank you, Ian. Back to you, Nani, to conclude the discussion.
Thank you so much. I see some recurring themes in our conversations. We've arrived at the end of our session, and I wanted to thank each and every single one of you for these very stimulating discussions. Thank you to our esteemed panelists, and thank you to the audience for your questions. We are very pleased to have been involved in this unique World Press Freedom Conference and want to thank UNESCO and the government of the Netherlands for organizing it. The issues covered today are of paramount importance, and we hope that you gained a stronger understanding of the need to protect freedom of expression and the safety of journalists, and engage in the fight to end impunity for crimes committed against them. Thank you all once again, and I now leave the floor to Karim for his final remarks.
Nani, thank you very much for moderating this session. It was a rich and inspiring session for me as well, but I hope also for you at home. We hope to have many more of these occasions and hopefully after the COVID pandemic to meet in person. Thank you very much, and I thank you all for watching this session.